It's all right.
I figured you'd understand.
Yeah, I forgot. Slap me up. All right. Forget, the teacher knows who's napping. Yeah, that's right. Well, that's good. We're picking up again where we left off. We're studying the period of time. Thank you, Jim. You are anticipating me every morning now. My usual coughing fit. Yeah, I usually end up with a coughing fit in the middle of all of this from the dry air or something. So we're looking at this period of time from the time that Judah went into captivity under the Gentile kings, and we're at the period of Darius, king of Persia. And this morning we're going to do something a little slightly different, but I want to give a little background before we get into it. Let's get this thing working. Turn it on. So Darius. Let's look at our timeline real quick. I think I'm a little far ahead of myself. I'm in the wrong spot, guys. Start right there. All right, last week we were looking at this timeline, kind of putting everything in perspective. What's happening, I try to do the pinkish ones representing what's happening with the Jewish people, and the blue, the Gentile kingdoms around at the time. And last week we looked at how Darius reconfirmed the edict of Cyrus, allowing the Jews to return to Israel to begin to rebuild the temple. And for a period of about 22 years, the building of the temple stopped as a result of opposition from local groups. Darius ascends to the kingdom, becomes the king, and they institute a search through the archives, and they find a copy of Cyrus's decree, and Darius reaffirms the decree and adds a little extra caveat to it that if you don't follow my advice or don't follow my decree, we're going to tear your house down and we are going to crucify you on the beams from your own house. So Darius is being used by the Lord to advance history in the direction the Lord intends it to go. Last week we talked about the stages being set, and when we looked at Daniel, the prophecies of Daniel was very specific about the kingdoms that are going to follow. We start with the Babylonians, and we're going to move to the Persians, and the prophecies also indicate the next kingdom in line was going to be the Greeks. The Greeks, because of the geography of Greece, I didn't really realize this until I got into it. Greece is only about 1/5 what they would call arable, farmable land. So that compelled the Greeks to do a lot of colonization around the Mediterranean area. So they established cities all around the Mediterranean rim in order to provide food and commerce and that sort of thing. Greece is mostly mountainous. The eastern edge of Asia Minor is populated by mostly Greek cities that have been colonized by the Greeks. And in the center, the red shows the areas where the Greeks are known to have established colonies. And we have what came to be known as the Ionian Revolt. When Darius conquered the Babylonian kingdom, he inherited Asia Minor as part of his kingdom. And these cities along the western coast are all Greek, mostly Greek culture, Greek language, Greek influence, Greek way of thinking, and all that sort of thing. And we have this Ionian Revolt, which is really the first step, I believe, in bringing down the Persian Empire and then bringing the Greeks onto the stage. This little central area around where the yellow is basically what was called Ionia. To the north was, I believe it was called Area, and to the south was Doria. And these cities did not take well to having the Persians establish rulers over their cities. They were becoming used to the idea of democracy, because democracy is just beginning in Athens about 20 years prior to this. And they revolted and tried to break away from the Persian Empire. And this sets into motion a chain of events that is going to eventually result in the downfall of Persia and the ascendancy of the Greeks. Darius puts down the rebellion, and in 490 he launches an expedition. He's going to punish Athens for their involvement in the Ionian Revolt. The Athenians had sent troops to assist. They had marched on Sardis and had burned it to the ground, and they burned a temple of a local goddess. I think her name was Kabibi. And the Persians use this as a pretext to go back to Athens and punish them for this. And Darius also knows that as long as Athens exists, they're going to be a thorn in the side of the Persian Empire, constantly fomenting these Greek cities to rebel against him. And so the Battle of Marathon marks the beginning of the end of the Persian Empire. It will take more than 150 years, but the Persians will fall to the Greeks under Alexander the Great. The Persian expedition against Athens will be the pretext for the Greeks invading and getting even with Persia 150 years from now. So, and then we'll get into this. Next week we're going to start with Xerxes, and we're going to spend some time in the book of Esther and show how the story of Esther begins, or it occurs in the reign of Xerxes, and the Lord is again using this in order to prepare the world for the Greek Empire and the Hellenization of the area. So the account of Esther begins in about the third year of Xerxes, according to Esther, first chapter, and then she becomes queen in the 6th year of his reign, and then Artaxerxes becomes king in 464, and then it's about the time that Ezra is going to Jerusalem during his reign. Now, I wanted to show something real quick. I want to show how this breaks when you drop it on the floor. The question I have, and I'm still researching it, and that is, why was the New Testament written in Greek? I understand that by the time Christ came, the Mediterranean had been pretty much Hellenized. The Greek language was the franca lingua of the area. It was the language of the realm, and if you want, it was to the empire at that time what English is to the world today. If you want to engage in commerce, you almost have to learn English. Of course, we're going to have to start learning Chinese, I guess, pretty soon. But why Greek? I have been spending some time trying to research it. This is my question, and I don't have the answer for it yet, is what was it about the Greek language that made it the language that the Lord chose for the writing of the New Testament? I've gone on a lot of blogs, and I've followed their discussions, and the one thing that everyone agrees is that God was he's not a passive bystander in the history of humanity. He's not just standing there. And then at the time Christ comes into the world, he's not sitting there thinking, oh, well, I guess this is as good a time as any, and he sends Christ in. But they're saying that he is an active orchestrator of history. He's orchestrating history for the specific purpose of having the New Testament written in Greek. And my great disadvantage here is that I've never studied Greek, so I can't, right now I've got to rely on the opinions of others to try to get some answers to the question. But I want to start out with, if you go back in Genesis 10:27, you remember the story where Abraham gets drunk, his son Ham finds him naked in the tent. And he goes out and he joyfully apparently tells everybody what he's found, And his other two sons walk backwards with the cloak on their shoulders, and they cover him up and cover his nakedness. He awakes and pronounces a curse on Canaan and pronounces the blessing on Japheth and Shem. And it says in Genesis 10:27 that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem. Japheth represents the Gentiles. Most of the Gentile nations of Europe are descendants of Japheth, and the Jews are descendants of Shem. It is through Shem that the Messiah is going to come, his family line. Did I put the batteries in backwards? Go ahead. I think that means that the Gentiles are going to share in the blessing of the Messiah. Okay, that's what I'm taking this to mean. That the Messiah is coming through the line, through Shem's family line, but the Gentiles are going to, God's intention is that the whole world is going to be saved. But the Gentiles, the descendants of Shem, or of Japheth, are also going to be sharers in the blessing that God intends for Israel. But our blessing is going to come through Jesus Christ. So dwelling in the tent, I believe, means sharing in the blessing. And I think we can show this here as we progress here. In Abraham 22:18, God affirms his covenant with Abraham and says, "In thy seed will all nations of the earth be blessed." Boy, I must have messed something up here. And we looked at Daniel. Greece is prophesied as replacing Persia. The known world is Hellenized according to God's sovereign plan. The New Testament will be written in Greek. Now, I've got some ideas of this that I've come across, and we'll address these later. And then here, we go up into the church age. Acts 6:16, 6-11. Paul is intending to go into Asia to preach the gospel, but the Holy Spirit prevents him and says no. He has the vision of the man from Macedonia saying, "Come over and help us." Rather than going to the east and preaching the gospel in Asia, he goes to the west and goes into Macedonia, Greece, and then we see that Christianity becomes established as a tradition of Western civilization. And according to God's plan, God directed Paul to go west rather than east, and so that Christianity is going to spread through Europe and go westward, and ultimately, with the founding of the New World and the Christians coming to the United States, we are all the beneficiaries of God's sovereign plan here in directing Paul going to the west rather than to the east. Now, if you look at the notes, Scofield's notes, he tries to lay out who these family groups are and what areas they populate, and the descendants of Japheth basically start populating the areas to the north, the west, the northwest, into Russia, Greece, Europe, going in that direction. So that Japheth's descendants, I think according to the prophecies we saw there in Genesis, they are brought in by the preaching of Paul, the Gentiles, into this blessing of saving knowledge of Christ. Now, I'm not saying that the gospel had no effect in the East, because we know that there are Christian believers, throughout the world, but predominantly the East is known by its pagan religions, Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism and all these pagan religions. That's what they're known for, Hinduism, whereas Christianity is the foundation of Western civilization, even though we are only Christian nominally. But anyways, so any questions on that? Does that make any sense to you, Mike? It does? Okay. What I'm saying is that the course of human events has been carefully orchestrated by the Lord for his own purposes. He's not just a passive bystander reacting to the way history is developing, but he's orchestrating it and he's directing things to a certain purpose. Now, what we're going to look at here is this is just historical information. I got a little video here on the Battle of Marathon and its impact. I want to show it to you. Just before we get to it, there are some things I wanted to mention. This fella, I disagree on a couple of things. Things he says. He puts the distance between Marathon and Athens at 22 miles. We know it's 26. And he downplays the numerical disadvantage that the Athenians were under during this battle. He says they're even. I think that their odds are basically 1 to 5. They're pretty much outnumbered in this particular battle. But this is setting the stage for the coming of the Greek Empire and the downfall of Persia. So that's where we're going to start here today. If I can get it to go here. My computer's decided to rest at this moment.
This is the Bay of Marathon on the eastern coast of Greece. I'm Matthew Settle. Over 2,000 years ago, in September 490 BC, 600 ships lay the entire length of the shoreline, while an army of 30,000 Persian invaders raced up the beach. Their mission? To capture Athens and conquer Greece for the empire of Darius, the king of Persia. But 11,000 Greek infantrymen stood in their way here at Marathon. Now, with new video game technology, you are about to see this great battle as never before. The vast numbers of soldiers, the troop formations, how they fought, and how the battle was won. Get the view the generals wish they'd had now in decisive battles. This is the burial mound of Marathon. Beneath me lie the remains of Greek soldiers who died in battle on 9/11, 490 BC. At that time, Greece was not a unified nation. It was a collection of independent city-states, like Athens, Corinth, and Sparta, each with their own laws and systems of government. The most influential city was Athens. 20 years earlier, the Athenians had gotten rid of their king, Hippias, who was a cruel and brutal ruler. Athens became a democracy and began to flex its muscle against Persia, the greatest power in the Mediterranean at the time. Athens even supported a revolt of some of the Greek islands, who were trying to break free from Persian rule.
The Persians saw themselves having a sort of God-given right to rule the world, and they expanded in every direction. They probably expected most countries and nations that they encountered to simply surrender. Their procedure of declaring war was in fact to demand a surrender, and if that wasn't then given, they would fight.
The Persian king Darius became furious with the Athenians. He decided that when the time was right, not only would he conquer Athens, but all of Greece.
Darius had a servant. Every time he sat down to dinner, before he would eat, the servant would whisper in his ear, "Sire, do not forget the Athenians."
So, when the deposed king, Hippias, fled from Athens to Persia, he received a friendly welcome.
I think it would be fair to regard Hippias essentially as a political pawn. The Persians weren't really too concerned what type of regime they would set up in conquered territory, so long as they were confident that he would be loyal to them.
In 491 BC, Darius sent envoys to Athens and Sparta. They demanded gifts of earth and water as acknowledgement of the power of Persia. The Greeks threw the envoys into a ravine used for executing criminals. The Spartans threw the second pair down a well.
What the Greeks most hated was the idea of slavery, of not being free, and they were determined not to allow themselves to be taken over by a foreign power without a fight.
Darius was furious. He assembled a huge fleet of 600 ships and mobilized his army. And when they set out for Greece in 490 BC, the exiled king Hippias sailed with them. The invasion force of 30,000 men was led by Datis, Persian commander in the west. Hippias was only too happy to advise him on the perfect landing place, the broad beach at Marathon Bay.
The Persians had very consciously picked a place that suited the kinds of forces that they had. Basically, within the territory of Athens, they couldn't have found pretty much a better place for them to land.
This is the plain of Marathon, 6 miles long and 2 miles broad. Apart from the marshes at either end, it's an unbroken plain, perfect for the battle tactics of the Persians with their light infantry and cavalry. Even in early September, these marshes were wet and soggy. A man couldn't walk on them, let alone several thousand horses. Hippias did not have a happy homecoming. As he jumped ashore, he had a coughing fit and spat out a tooth. When he looked for it in the sand, he couldn't find it. And he took this as a sign from the gods that he would not regain his kingdom. While Datis unloaded his ships and assembled his men, the Greek army was gathering in the mountains overlooking Marathon. This Athenian army was made up of many local tribes loyal to Athens, 1,000 men each from 11 tribes, each commanded by its own general. But in overall command was the Greek general Miltiades. Missing from these 11,000 men with the fiercest and most feared Greek fighting force, the Spartans. Miltiades sent a runner, Pheidippides, to Sparta to ask for help.
The Greeks generally used runners as messengers, sometimes horsemen, but very often runners, partly perhaps due to the rough terrain that they often had to negotiate.
Pheidippides was a day runner, someone who could run all day delivering messages. According to the historian, Herodotus, he ran the 150 miles between Athens and Sparta in 2 days, but his epic run was all in vain. The Spartans were celebrating a religious festival.
The Spartans were notoriously pious, notoriously slow, notoriously tardy, and arrogant in a way. And I think they felt, oh, we'll just get over there when we get there.
Athens would stand alone. Miltiades faced impossible odds. We know very little about this Greek commander. He was from a leading family in Athens and must have had considerable military experience when commander of the army. But we may have one link that stretches back 2,500 years. This helmet is an exact replica of the one recovered by archaeologists. It's from exactly the right period and had the inscription, Miltiades dedicates this helmet to Zeus. It was very probably Miltiades' own helmet. It was exactly the kind worn by the Greeks at Marathon. The Greek army fought as infantrymen, or hoplites. They were called this after the shield they carried, the hoplon.
The shield of the hoplite was a big shield, about 1 meter wide, but it covered only half the body, and therefore the protection comes from the overlapping of each shield with the man next to him.
From the mountains high above Marathon, Miltiades and his 10 generals had a clear view of the Persian army arrayed beneath them. This was an army over twice their number, with archers from Ethiopia, swordsmen from the banks of the Indus, and wild horsemen from the steppes of Asia. Although all these men were the subjects of King Darius of Persia, they had little in common with one another. Not even a common language. The Greeks, on the other hand, were neighbors, standing shoulder to shoulder and brother to brother, fighting to save their independence and way of life. Memories of the tyrant Hippias were fresh in their minds, and death was preferable to him regaining the Athenian crown. But neither side seemed eager for a fight. For 4 days, the two armies faced each other in a nervous standoff.
One reason why the Greeks waited is simply that they were in a very strong position there. They could not, as such, be forced. And the Persians, being so much larger, had a supply problem, and therefore it was quite likely that supplies would run low and that they might even consider retiring.
Datis was holding back in hope that the Athenians, still loyal to Hippias, might rise up and seize control of Athens. On the Greek side, Miltiades waited, perhaps in the hope that his forces might be bolstered by the promised Spartan contingent. Neither side would make a move. But in the Persian camp, Datis was hatching a daring battle plan that would break the deadlock. Soon the killing and fighting would begin. Battle of Marathon. September 490 BC, on the plain of Marathon in Greece, a mighty Persian invasion force was waiting to go into battle against a small Greek army intent on saving their country, their freedom, and their way of life. After 4 days of stalemate, the Persian commander Datis decided to gamble everything on a quick victory. Under cover of darkness, he loaded all of his cavalry and some of his infantry back onto his ships. While the Athenian army was at Marathon, he would sail round the coast, land his troops, and attack the unprotected city of Athens. His faithful commander, Artaphernes,
would stay at Marathon with a holding force of around 12,000 men.
If Datis thought he could load thousands of horses and men onto his ships and sail quietly away into the night, he was very much mistaken. Miltiades' scouts uncovered the ruse.
The Greeks consequently realized here is a danger and an opportunity. The danger is if we don't act now, the city will be captured behind our backs. The opportunity is we can march down into the plain now and take them on because they won't have time to unship their cavalry again.
Miltiades had to move quickly. It would take Datis more than 10 hours to sail to Athens and several more hours to unload his army. Miltiades had to win a quick victory at Marathon and then march at full speed back to Athens to confront Datis.
What they did was seize what the Greeks called kairos. They had a word meaning opportunity, the opportune moment. And I think the genius of Miltiades is indeed largely responsible for their choosing the right moment.
Miltiades marshaled his 11,000 hoplites and readied them for battle. Greeks would normally have formed a rectangular phalanx, but he was worried by the length of the enemy battle line. The Persians could sweep around both sides and envelop the Greek army.
We know this kind of detail because of two Greek historians. Herodotus, who wrote in the years after the battle and may even have met some survivors, and Plutarch, who wrote 400 years later but used material from earlier histories.
Miltiades took a huge risk and tore up the battle manual. He abandoned the traditional phalanx formation and deployed his troops along the widest possible front, so that the center of the line was much thinner than usual, 4 men deep as opposed to the customary 8. But on each wing, he retained the 8 ranks of the conventional phalanx. He wanted to protect his flanks.
The Greek heavily armored infantry, they had a 3-foot shield that would cover them from brow to knee, greaves down here on the shin guards, and then a helmet with just eye slits, so that when they put that helmet at the rim of the shield, they really were pretty much invulnerable.
As the Greek army rolled forward, Miltiades was already thinking of the next problem. The massed ranks of Persian archers, deadly at up to 300 yards. The Greeks would have to cover that final distance at speed, or risk being slaughtered.
They marched forward at a sedate pace, the usual sedate pace of a hoplite army advancing, until they came within bowshot, which is maybe 100 yards or so.
Once within bowshot, the Greeks came under a hail of arrows. Miltiades' troops broke into a run. This astonished the Persians. The phalanx, by its very nature, usually went into battle at a slow, steady pace.
The Persian archers would have posed a very serious threat to the hoplite force. They had very powerful bows and large arrows that could have done serious damage.
Imagine yourself in full armor, with a heavy shield, spear and sword, a total weight of 70 pounds, having to race to the enemy and be able to put up a strong fight when you reached him.
There was a British historian who actually built himself a suit of hoplite armor and went to Marathon and ran from approximately the place where the Athenian camp was to the site of the battle, and showed that a fit man could actually run that distance in armor.
The hoplites trained hard for this. There was even a hoplite event in the Olympic Games of the period, which involved sprinting over 400 yards in full kit and armor. The Persians were puzzled. From their ranks, all they could see was a long line of Greeks running down on them. Surely they would be out of breath before they even got close enough to fight. These Persian infantrymen were more skirmisher troops than heavy infantry. Lightly armed with short spears and scimitars, they formed ranks as a line of steel-tipped spears came hurtling towards them. The two armies clashed head-on. The Persians soon realized their weapons were hopeless against the Greek army, but they fought back valiantly, and by sheer weight of numbers began pushing the Greek center back. It looked like Miltiades' gamble had failed, and all the while Datis was sailing closer to Athens.
It is 490 BC,
The Greek army is being pushed back by Persian invaders, and a Persian fleet is on its way to attack Athens. As the Greeks fell back in the center, the Persian commander, Artaphernes, smelled victory.
The way in which Miltiades drew out the Athenian army, enormously lengthening and thinning his center, was one of the riskiest things, I think, in all of ancient warfare.
But now the strong Greek phalanxes, on the wings, beat back the thinner Persian line and began to push in towards the center. Each phalanx moved on command, as one unit, wheeling left or right, almost turning on a dime. Miltiades' gamble had paid off. As the center fell back, his wings slowly encircled the enemy. The slaughter began in earnest, as the heavily armored Greeks hammered into the Persian divisions.
And then that whole center of the Persian army became essentially a killing zone.
Certainly, to fight that way took great strength and great endurance. And you haven't even talked about the heat of the summer.
The Persians continued to throw themselves onto the attacking phalanx, desperately trying to find a way to break it. In the meantime, the Persian archers poured thousands of arrows into the Greek lines, now so closely packed with the Persian infantry that they were bound to hit their own soldiers. The Greeks felt that right and might were on their side and fought like men possessed.
Tactics were not so important in those days. It was more just the guts to stand next shoulder to shoulder with your mates and carry on the fight.
The Persians were a broken force. They had never been defeated by the Greeks. But now thousands of their soldiers lay dead or died. Suddenly the Persians broke and ran for their ships, desperate to escape the slaughter. The Greeks raced to cut off their retreat and chased them to the water's edge.
There was chaos on the beach, the stampeding troops pushing and heaving to get their craft away, while trying to defend themselves from the pursuing hoplites. The surviving Persians sailed away, while the Greeks collapsed, exhausted in the sand.
But there was no time to rest. While the battle was raging at Marathon, Datis and his Persian troops were sailing closer to Athens. Miltiades ordered his tired and battle-weary troops to Athens, a forced march of 22 miles in full armor. It had taken him just over 3 hours to defeat the Persian army at Marathon, but that meant that Datis was 3 hours closer to Athens. It was a race against time.
He sent a runner on ahead with news of victory. According to legend, it was Phidippides, the same man who had run to Sparta. He ran the 22 miles here to Athens and shouted, "Rejoice, we have victory," then fell dead from exhaustion. Miltiades arrived in the nick of time and managed to set his troops up around Athens. Datis was dismayed when he sailed around the bay and found the Greek army waiting for him.
I misjudged my time this